That is very good. The swing works, the Oracle again.
And the Oracle bowled in. That is out. Great theatre, magnificent drama.
First match of the season, eh, Howard?
First match of the season, Martin.
King Willow's on his throne and all's right with the world.
Gods and Flannelled Fools. It's from a poem about cricket.
Oh, very apt. How does it go on, my old Howard?
That's the only line I know.
Oh, but never mind, you certainly made the point.
Hello, and welcome to Gods and Flannelled Fools, episode 13, Blackwashed. This is the series in which I walk through a history of English Test match cricket, focusing on key series, matches, players and teams of a particular interest, basically exploring the myths and legends of the game that collectively have led to how we view Test match cricket today. If you haven't already listened, my pilot episode, A Brief History of the Game, up to the very first two Test matches in 1877, is available, as well as the first 12 episodes in which I cover a variety of series, themes, individuals, ranging from the early legends of the English game in the golden era, prior to the two world wars, through to the Bodyline series and timeless tests, and then on to post-war series of the 50s and 60s, and some fiercely contested Ashes series in the 70s. So worth checking those out on my channel. There's a Twitter profile for the series, at GFFpod, and I'll also make some notes in support of this on the blog, which is available at godsandflannelledfools.blogspot.com. So in the last episode, I took a look at the meteoric rise to fame of Ian Botham in the late 70s, his, disastrous elevation to England captain in 1980, and then his subsequent return to form in the astonishing Ashes series of 1981, which has since been dubbed Botham's Ashes. In that series, it was the return of Mike Brearley as England captain, who many felt brought the correct management of the talented all-rounder back to the fore. Of course, having been persuaded to return to the role, he quickly departed once more after the series to be replaced firstly by Keith Fletcher and then by Bob Willis, who was right at the end of his career. And this period saw comfortable home wins against India and then New Zealand, but an away Ashes loss, conceding the urn back to Australia. Whilst several of the stalwarts of the 70s, including Willis, Brearley, Boycott, gradually faded out of the side, some of the younger players began to establish themselves. The standout batsman of this period was David Gower, and he was made captain in 1983 for the tour to Pakistan. The England selectors, having apparently not been put off by the experiment with Ian Botham when it came to making their best player skipper. And Gower had consistently stood out in the top order, firstly as one of the most elegant batsmen to represent his country, since the war, and secondly as someone who could make runs against most attacks on a wide variety of surfaces, home and away. And perhaps the only criticism he faced was a lack of concentration, coupled with a tendency to feel for the ball outside off stump. And this was a contributing factor to not having converted more than 7 of his scores into hundreds at this point in his career. As Botham found to his cost, however, on the horizon was a home series against the West Indies, who, since their last tour, had grown even stronger and were conquering all that stood before them. Gower's challenge was not only to ensure that the captaincy didn't negatively impact his form with the bat, like so many other English players, but also to galvanise his own players in the wake of what was becoming a seriously difficult psychological challenge of coming up against a 4-pronged fast bowling attack that had been honed since the mid-70s, and the likes of which had not been seen at any point throughout history.
When you were involved in a test match against the West Indies in that era, a team which contained 4 of the fastest bowlers of all time, People that can't bat, couldn't bat, weren't as quick with their reactions, weren't as well equipped with a technique that was designed to cope with the quickest of bowling. This was the ultimate test of courage for them. You're not allowed to say the word fear, you shouldn't admit to being frightened, but you can be. It is a worrying time.
I don't believe there's a player who doesn't have nerves. If he is, he's either a liar, or he's an idiot. There's somebody who can seriously damage you. But you have to go in and face it. Now that is real courage.
There is a very human thing here. And you see people, the ones that would sit in the dressing room, sitting there, not quite doing this. They're not shaking. But in some cases, they could be pretty close to it.
I've seen guys smoking. They're having a smoke and they're putting it out and then they're lighting up another. And while they're waiting to go in, they're so agitated and nervous that there's so many cigarettes there, hardly smoke, but they just keep puffing at it because they don't know what to do with themselves. It's frightening, absolutely frightening, and it builds up and builds up because as a wicket falls and another wicket falls, it's slowly and surely, it's like torture. It's getting nearer and nearer to their turn to go in and face the music. You see them practicing in front of the mirror. I've seen them helmets on. They've got face masks, they've got arm guards, they've got like Michelin X-Men with rubber round here for getting hit under the heart and the ribs, which is a terrible area, really hurts there. There's no muscle here, you see. There's no muscle, just ribs, so you can break a rib, and if it hits in your heart, you go down like a sack of potatoes, let me tell you. So, and you have to laugh a bit like I'm doing now because you can see they're absolutely terrified.
When we used to play against the West Indies, I would prepare my players. I would tell them that this is a test of your courage. And telling them that if I found any player, if he lacked courage, I would send him home straight away. I would drop him from the team.
In my mind, I knew it was going to be tough. Like all batsmen, I knew that any time I batted against quick bowling, I could get hurt. But I never tried to think about it because I thought, look, there's no point in going there. If you go there about getting hit and hurt, I don't see how you can focus on your job. And so I got myself into the frame of mind that this was the sort of attack we were going to get, and I did my preparation.
Since the emergence of Roberts and Holding in the mid-70s, the West Indies had added a number of others to their attack. Initially, this included Wayne Daniel, nicknamed the Black Diamond, followed by Sylvester Clarke, an unpredictable yet powerful fast bowler who often played against county attacks, terrorising a lot of the English batsmen. They also had Joel Garner, a very, very tall bowler whose ability to produce steepling bounce set batsmen on the back foot, only to deliver an accurate toe-crushing Yorker. And also Colin Croft, a bowler who many felt had anger management issues, who bowled the ball from wide of the crease with a chest-on whirlwind action, which led to the ball jagging back towards the batsman at high pace. Of all these fast bowlers, however, the one who had emerged at the start of the decade in the most spectacular manner was a Barbadian who didn't possess the sheer size of these other quick bowlers, but who was not only at times faster, but also had a lethal ability to control the ball seemingly at will, and would in time go on to become regarded as perhaps the greatest quick bowler of all time. Here are a few thoughts from Jeff Boycott on Malcolm Denzel Marshall.
Malcolm Marshall, for me, was probably the greatest of all the quicks. It's only a judgment call. He has great figures, about 370 wickets at 20 point something. But it's not the figures alone again. He could bowl very fast. When he was young, he was very, very quick, and he kept that up for a long time. But if he wanted to, he had the ability to cut down his pace and still be fairly sharp and swing the ball and cut it off the seam. And also, he's one of the few fast bowlers that have gone to Asia on these slower pitches that only bounce just above stump eye and get wickets, quite a lot of wickets. And the reason for that is most fast bowlers run in with a lot of energy and bang the ball in, and if you're bowling on slow pitches, it comes off quite slow. Gives the batsman more time to play it. But Marshall skidded the ball. It skidded through, so it actually kept on going. That is very difficult for us batsmen. And when he bowled a bouncer, it skidded at you this height. It didn't go in and over your head so easily. So he was an awkward customer, big heart, strong, and very intelligent. Well, I remember when he first came to Hampshire from Barbados, Andy Roberts was finishing, and they wanted another fast bowler, and they asked Peter Short, who was president in Barbados, have you got anybody? He said, well, we've got a young kid about 19. And he came over to England, unknown, about 19 years of age, very little skinny lad, and he ran in with his little steps, and he was like lightning. I thought he was an unbelievable bowler. I'm sad that he's passed away with cancer. I played county cricket against him, played test match cricket. He was a great competitor on the field, a smashing guy off the field. When we'd be taking our bats and pads out of the boot of the car before a county match, he would shout sometimes, Boyks, are you hooking today? And I would say, not if you're bowling, I'm not. And he'd just laugh. And he would always bowl a bouncer, third or fourth ball, and I definitely ducked because it was quick, and he'd finish right close to me and say, okay, Boyks, now let the contest begin. He just wanted to let me know that he could bowl quick bouncers, and he wanted to see if I was going to try and hook, because I thought he was very awkward to hook because he skidded through, he skimmed through at you.
The 5-match home series against the West Indies began at Birmingham on the 14th of June 1984. There was a certain degree of optimism for England, especially when it came to the batting lineup. Joining the flamboyant Gower was the tenacious Mike Gatting from Middlesex, a player with varied form but a great heart and stomach for a fight, along with Alan Lamb, a tough South African batsman who'd grown up on quick surfaces. Having lost Graham Gooch and Jeff Boycott at the top of the order, both having been banned from Test cricket for 3 years for their participation in the 1982 South African Rebel Tour, both opening slots were up for grabs, and the selectors went for Graham Fowler, the attacking Lancastrian left-hander, and Andy Lloyd, a tenacious Warwickshire opener. Only half an hour into the first test, in front of his home crowd, having battled his way to double figures against this magnificent bowling attack, Lloyd found himself on the wrong end of a homing missile from Marshall.
Larry Gomes took catching position just round the corner, very square for Andy Lloyd. Gomes was some 10 or 12 yards behind square a little earlier. Oh dear me. Oh, I didn't like the look of that at all. Just got him on the side of the head, I would think, where that protective plastic or perspex comes down. But that did look very nasty. And that looks as though he's sustained a cut, and there's certainly a little bit of shock there. Yes, it was of such a height that he could actually have played it defensively.
It's obviously he's annoyed and doesn't want to come off. But I think it is the most sensible thing to do.
Despite wearing a helmet, Andy Lloyd was taken to hospital where he remained for a week with double vision. He didn't play for the rest of the season and wouldn't represent his country again. His eyesight never fully recovered from the impact. The England team slumped to an innings defeat, the psychological impact of their new opener being felled in such a brutal manner, perhaps being worse than the loss itself. At Lord's 10 days later, having selected Chris Broad, father of the current England bowler Stewart, to replace Lloyd, they put up a better fist of things, with Fowler scoring his maiden 100 and Broad joining him with a 50 in a respectable first innings score of 286. Able, thanks to an 8-wicket haul from Ian Botham, to establish a first innings lead, they then pressed home their advantage in the second innings thanks to a fine 100 from Alan Lamb, setting the West Indies a record-breaking 342 runs to win on the final day with only 78 overs remaining. Scenting a possible rare victory and seemingly guaranteed at least a safe draw, England fans watched aghast as Gordon Greenidge strode to the wicket and promptly dismantled the English attack in one of the most brutal innings of all time, smashing 214 not out as they made a mockery of the target in only 66 overs for the loss of just 1 wicket. So having been mentally defeated firstly by the West Indies' pace attack and then by their batting lineup, the series was all but over. At Headingley, Michael Holding became the first West Indian to take 200 Test wickets, and Marshall took 7 for 53 in the second innings, despite bowling with a broken hand as they won by 8 wickets. That was despite another gallant 100 from the impressive Alan Lamb. Even with Marshall missing for the 4th Test at Old Trafford, England couldn't prevent another double century from Greenwich as they lost by an innings to go 4-0 down, and then limped to the final Test at the Oval, where they lost by 172 runs in a match in which Ian Botham became the first all-rounder to take 300 wickets and make 3,000 runs in Tests. It just went to show that this was not a case of England being a hopeless side without any talent. Instead, they just happened to be playing a side who were in the process, of going down as one of the greatest sporting teams in history, in any sport. The tour in the 1984 season would be the last for the West Indian captain Clive Lloyd, who would retire from the side at the end of the year. And the glimmer of hope offered from some optimistic pundits was that perhaps the West Indian team would begin to come apart without their great leader, and with 1 or 2 of their better players falling off the radar. This would turn out to be somewhat foolish sentiment. Despite the thrashing, Gower kept his job as captain, and England went on to play Sri Lanka at home in an apparently easy test in which they could only draw. However, against all odds, the tour to India that followed was a resounding success. Despite Ian Botham having opted out of the tour, and with the South African rebels being absent, the side rallied together with a collection of individual performances. Although they went 1-0 down at Bombay, Gatting made a maiden 100, and then they registered a victory at Delhi with new opener Tim Robinson making a ton. An impressive victory in the 4th Test at Madras gave them a 2-1 away win. Taking this momentum and team spirit into the Ashes series of 1985, and bolstered by the return of Graham Gooch and Ian Botham, David Gower enjoyed a golden summer as they thrashed Australia to regain the Ashes in a 3-1 series victory, ending the series with 732 runs at an average of over 81 with 3 glorious Test hundreds. It seemed that finally England had found a balance and a place for all their star players, and it was with this note of optimism that Gower registered his flippant comment on the Oval balcony when asked about the forthcoming tour to the Caribbean in the winter and his team's chances. "I'm sure they're quaking in their boots," came his famous reply. As much as this might have sounded hopelessly optimistic, many experts felt that England did at least have an outside chance of success. Having won away in India and been so dominant in the Ashes series, England were undoubtedly regarded as the second best side in the world. And whilst the West Indies were head and shoulders above any team, some felt that perhaps they were past their peak. The cricket correspondent for The Guardian, Matthew Engel, reflected this mood by stating that 2-1 to the West Indies might actually be a reasonable guesstimate. It was only 18 months since the West Indies had won 5-0 in England, but the common perception was that they had aged and England had matured. The argument for England, they said, was that they had the best batting lineup in the world. In 1985 they averaged a huge 52 runs per wicket, miles clear of everyone else. And they had the best spin bowling attack too. 2 of the tests were to be played at Trinidad, which usually took spin. They'd picked 3 fast-bowling specialists, the batsmen David Smith and Peter Willey, 2 genuinely hard men, and the Glamorgan bowler Greg Thomas, often described as the fastest white bowler in the world at the time. They had a solid seam attack, and Ian Botham, who'd bowled faster than ever during the Ashes, was overdue against the West Indies. By contrast, the West Indies had an inexperienced captain in Viv Richards and an ageing team with 6 regulars in their 30s. However, even before the tour began, there were problems. The first was that Gower's mother died a week before the team flew out. The second was that the tour schedule, with only 3 first-class matches and an ODI before the first test, and a substandard set of net facilities, to say the least, on which to practice. Politics also played a part, with 4 of the touring party having previously been on the Rebel Tour to South Africa 4 years ago, and this drew a great deal of unwanted attention from the local media and a certain degree of hostility from the crowds and some of the opposition players. As I'd seen before, when it came to motivation, the West Indies arsenal of pace bowlers required little extra to ignite them when faced with a challenge from England on home soil. Teams such as India, New Zealand and Australia had seen for themselves that the West Indian bowlers were getting faster and more unplayable than ever.
The people that they say are bowling at 90 mile an hour, people like Michael Holding, Marshall, Croft were bowling quicker than that. Definitely quicker. The ball has to travel 22 yards, but if you think about it, the batsman stood 1 yard in front of his crease. The ball has to travel then, maybe 7, 8, 9 yards before you can react. So your eye has to wait for the ball to travel. Your eye then decides whether it's pitched up or whether it's short, whether it's wide, whether you've got a duck. So you've really maybe only got 12 to 14 yards. Remember, at pace, nearly 100 mile an hour, 0.3 of a second probably, and you've got to make up your mind what to do. Not just get out of the way, you've actually got to hit it and score runs. Then it becomes very difficult.
And it's not easy to explain. The more you have to think about it, the less time you have actually to do it. And if you're playing in a situation where you have, say, 0.4 of a second to see a ball from a bowler's hand and do something about it when it arrives at your end, 0.4 of a second later, you don't want to waste time for a 0.1 of a second thinking about it. It needs to be instinctive. So the moment your instincts are compromised, the moment you're having to think about how you're playing this game or whether you're quite getting it right, it just makes it harder. And those are the times you are mentally and therefore potentially physically most vulnerable.
The cricket ball is a small, very hard, and particularly when it's new and the seam is raised. The ball is really hard. When it hits, it breaks bones. It really does hurt. The awkward area is here at the heart, because it's very difficult to get out of the way to manoeuvre, or at the neck area, and the more they persistently keep at you, mathematically, the more chances you're going to get hit, you're going to get hurt, and you've got to pick yourself up and carry on and know you're going to get hit again. And it is very difficult. People started to realise there was so much fast bowling around, they better get a bit of protection.
Both Gower and Botham were rested from the opening tour match, where England were bowled out for only 94 by the Windward Islands, the only Shell Shield side with no West Indian cricketers. Their presence sipping beers on a yacht ignited many so-called journalists to go all out towards them. And it's worth remembering that this was the height of the tabloid war, with almost anything being allowed to be published. Botham was a particular target, with accusations of infidelity leading him to the point where he confined himself in the hotel room for much of the time. Gower himself was ridiculously accused of having an affair with Paul Downton, the wicketkeeper's wife. England did impressively win their tour match in Jamaica, but Gower was worryingly experiencing a poor run of form, suffering a comprehensive working over from a young and raw Courtney Walsh, during which he was hit on the hand, helmet and forearm. Walsh couldn't even get into the West Indies squad for the first test, but there was a reason for his appearance in the tour game, which was to prevent, strategically, another Jamaican quick bowler from playing so that England wouldn't get a look at him ahead of the test series. Balfour Patrick Patterson was picked to play for the West Indies in the first ODI match a few days later. A tall, powerfully built man with a frame like a heavyweight boxer, gap-toothed and bow-legged, few fast bowlers have been quite as intimidating just in looks alone. He'd been in deadly form during the Shell Shield season, routing several sides, causing trouble for the star West Indian batsman and causing no end of physical injuries, including smashing out the front teeth of the Leeward Island opener Luther Kelly. He was suffering with an upset stomach on his debut, so wasn't firing at full speed, but still bowled quickly to dismiss both Robinson and Gower. However, it wasn't yet the arrival of Patterson that the game is known for. Mike Gatting, the form batsman of the tour to this point, attempted to hook a delivery from Malcolm Marshall that skidded off the surface and smashed into his face. It was fortunate that his gloves took some of the pace off the ball, but less so that he was not wearing a protective grill in his helmet. Here are Alan Lamb and David Gower talking about the injuries, firstly to Andy Lloyd and then to Mike Gatting at the hands of Marshall.
I'll never forget Andy Lloyd in '84 at Birmingham, and he got crusted by Marshall, and he went down like a sack of potatoes. It wasn't a pleasant sight, I can tell you that.
It must have got him sort of quite close to the temple there, and it gave him a nasty bang, a really, really nasty bang. We lost him for the game.
He's walking off, and there's sort of his whole face jaws been rearranged, and it's not a great sight. You try not to look because it's not a great confidence booster seeing someone come off who's been struck on the head.
And I've seen worse. For instance, Mike Gatting in '86 at Sabina Park on a dodgy pitch, a hard but uneven pitch, and being hit right on the bridge of the nose. And I don't want to describe it too much, for those that might be a bit squeamish. But basically, you have what was a relatively normal nose. For Mike, I wouldn't say it was an entirely normal nose, was now a very flat nose. They picked it literally. Turn away if you are squeamish. They picked a bit of bone out of the ball, and you've got blood on the crease. So the next man in, probably me actually, the next man in has to sort of go, well, make a mark here somewhere, but maybe not in the blood.
That was terrible. Gat's face wasn't looking too good when he came off. He was a horrendous mess. In the back of your mind, you're thinking, get me out of here. I don't want to be here. Let me tell you, your bottom's twitching.
It can't help but think, I wonder if that's going to be me next. The people that got out that morning were probably quite grateful. You think, well, thank God for that. I've made it out intact. Wouldn't say you're proud of it, but sometimes making it out intact can be a bonus.
When Gat got hit, they shouted, I think Gat's been hit in the mouth, and I think a throwaway line by Phil Edmonds must have said, he must have thought it was a pork pie going past, you see. So, it did raise a bit of a ripple in the dressing room, but that game, it was lethal, and I think we were shell-shocked after that. When you plan something like that against the best, just through the confidence of all the players, the tour was over, to be honest.
My ambitions have been crushed, my dreams have been crushed, my wrist has been crushed.
The injury was so bad that, as Gower said in that clip, a piece of bone had to be removed from the ball before the next delivery could be bowled, and there was a pool of blood on the wicket for the remainder of the game. With 2 black eyes and a hole where his nose had once been, Gatting was flown home for surgery, having experienced breathing difficulties. It was clear that the psychological nightmares of the previous series had come back to haunt Gower's team. 3 days later, on the 21st of February 1986, the teams came together for the first test at Sabina Park, Jamaica. By this stage, some of the vitriol from the media had turned to genuine empathy, even fear. The match was not televised due to a financial dispute between the BBC and the West Indies board, and this is actually the last England match of which there's no footage. This lack of footage has made it something of a mythical nightmare. Following Gatting's injury in the one-day match, the Times' John Woodcock wrote that he thought someone might be killed. And having inspected the pitch, Wisden Cricket Monthly said it was cricket's equivalent to the Somme. The strip was mostly bowled with lumps of turf here and there and a green section in the middle. To this day, Peter Willey describes it as the worst wicket he's ever played cricket on. Richie Richardson, who played in the abandoned test in the 97-98 series, reckons the 1986 pitch was worse. And all this against the greatest side in history who had reached their zenith. England won the toss and Gower chose to bat, his side making the perfect start, batting with skill and calmness against Malcolm Marshall and Joel Garner to reach 32. An hour into the innings, Viv Richards brought on Patrick Patterson as first change from the George Headley end, and all hell broke loose. Having shaken off his illness and returned to full speed, Patterson was lethal. Aside from the broken pitch, the sight screen had been lowered in order to accommodate the views of spectators, and this made the delivery point harder to pick out. Robinson was caught at slip, fending off a homing missile from his face, and Gower slashed his second and third deliveries for 4 and 6 over third man. Their teammates in the dressing room looked on in horror. He was a shock, said Botham in his autobiography. He was murderously quick, so raw and full of hatred, like Colin Croft and Sylvester Clarke rolled into one. What made it more intimidating was Patterson's muscular style. Perhaps Andrew Miller from Cricinfo described it best as a stiff-limbed, stud-slamming action like a windmill being ripped off its axis in a hurricane. Patterson got the ball to lift viciously off the hard, rigid surface, and you have to consider that in 1986 there was no limit on the number of bounces that could be bowled. It was left to the umpires to judge whether, in accordance with Law 42, the bowling was deliberately intimidatory. The batsman got some protection from one umpire, David Archer, but Johnny Gale, who was at Patterson's end, saw nothing wrong. As a batsman and umpire, Peter Willey has seen all the great fast bowlers of the last 40 years. None left an impression quite like Patterson. If people are bowling 90 miles an hour now, he says, Patterson must have been bowling well over 100 miles an hour in that game. Perhaps more tellingly, Graham Gooch wrote that it's the only time he's ever felt in mortal danger of his life facing fast bowling. And this from a man who faced all the quicks, right from Jeff Thompson in the mid-70s through to Wasim and Wakar in the mid-90s. Marshall, Holding and Garner were 3 all-time greats, yet it was Patterson who stood out. If anyone has ever bowled quicker than that, said Gooch, well, he was rapid, and I mean really rapid. Perhaps the best person to cast judgment is the West Indian keeper Jeff Dujon, who kept wicket to all the quicks throughout the 80s and early 90s. Here, he's asked this very question by Jonathan Agnew.
So, same question that I put to Rodders then, come on, the ones that you kept wicket to. How on earth do you try and distinguish? People must ask you all the time, who was the fastest one of all of that crowd? And you kept to all those great West Indian fast bowlers, didn't you?
Well, I reckon that, when you get up into a certain pace bracket, 1 or 2 miles an hour doesn't really make too much difference. But every now and then, and I will say, because he made a very marked impression on me on a couple of occasions where I just said, well, I've never ever kept to anything this quick. And that was Patrick Patterson.
Oh, really?
On a couple of occasions.
That's interesting,
yes.
Because you wouldn't necessarily go for that, would you? If it's going off the West Indies fast bowlers off the top of your head, that's a really interesting shout.
Well, he just got it right a couple of times. First time I think was against England in when he just started. Could have been his first test in Kingston.
Yes.
Gat can tell you about
1985, was it? I think.
And that was rapid.
Yes.
And he got, the Aussies pissed him off in about 87, I think it was, at Melbourne. And
England were bowled out for 159 in 45.3 overs, with Patterson taking 4 for 30. The strange thing about the Sabina Park test is the only person who retired hurt was a West Indian batsman. Late on the first day, Gordon Greenidge hooked Botham into his own face and needed 3 stitches. The West Indies finished the day on 85 for none, though that particular score flattered them, as the impressive Greg Thomas could have bagged a couple of wickets himself. Unfortunately, the England bowlers didn't have anywhere near the pace of the West Indian quicks, and yet repeatedly banged the ball in, which simply stirred up trouble for their second innings. The West Indies were dismissed for 307, a lead of 148. On the third day, Robinson, who would go on to have a miserable tour, far from the triumphs of the previous summer, was bowled for a duck, and Gooch followed for naught in the next over from Marshall. It was soon time for Patterson's second crack at England, a 6-over spell of unprecedented viciousness that John Woodcock in the Times described as being as fast as a man can bowl, with Wisden comparing it as faster than Jeff Thompson of Australia in his prime. One bouncer cleared everybody and landed just inside the boundary, nearly going for 6 byes. Gower was caught at third man, placed there deliberately as a catcher 2 balls earlier. Lamb was hit on the helmet and the body. He slapped 3 boundaries and was caught top-edging a hook. Botham top-edged a 6 off Patterson and then was then bowled by a Marshall delivery that shot along the floor, Marshall having been stirred up by the speed contest with Patterson at the other end. Peter Willey, the hard man and specialist for these awful conditions, was pushed up to 4 and made an absolutely extraordinary 71 from 104 balls. I had a bit of humour on, he said afterwards. It was horrible. One ball was going past your throat, one was going past your ankles, so I decided to have a swing at anything that was in the slot. Sometimes it's not you batting. You're in the zone. You don't think about what you're going to do, it just happens. There's no time to think. Despite there being no footage of this match, if you search on YouTube for a video entitled Cricket Calypso 1986 Ian Wooldridge documentary, there's a section towards the end showing snippets of their quicks bowling during the remainder of the series, and around the 49.5-minute mark, you can see Patterson bowling to Willey in a later test, giving you an indication of the sheer speed involved. As the match drew to a close, Phil Edmonds was hit over the heart by an accidental beamer from Patterson, and he later described it as feeling as if his chest had caved in, despite wearing the sort of chest guard that jockeys use. There are photos of him on a beach a few days later with a grotesque crater just below his left nipple. The longer the match went on, the less like a civilised game of cricket it became, wrote Woodcock. I think I've never felt it more likely that we should see somebody killed. The West Indies needed 5 runs to complete a 10-wicket victory. England lasted 88.2 overs in the match. Not unusual these days, but almost without precedent in 1986. It was 79 years since they'd been bowled out so quickly in both innings of a test, and yet it was felt by the pundits that no other team could have coped any better in the circumstances. This was the best team of all time at the very peak of their talents. England would go on to lose the series 5-0, with the psychological damage inflicted at Sabina Park being impossible to come back from. Aside from the nuclear warhead pace attack, there were masterful performances from Richie Richardson with the bat, and finally Viv Richards, who in the final test in Antigua blasted a 56-ball century, a record that would stand for 30 years until Brendan McCullum beat it in 2016. Though the public sympathy was on hand for the English players, and particularly Gower, who had borne the brunt of the problems, the trauma would live on. None of the players of this era would ever experience a series win against the West Indies. After the 1986 series, the West Indies team slowly began to decline, though they were still a great team, through to the end of the decade and into the 90s, at which point the likes of Greenidge, Richards, Dujon and Marshall all retired, and meanwhile Patterson fell out of favour due to disciplinary issues. The 1986 series was the conclusion of a 4-year spell in which they won 7 series in a row and had a record of 23 wins and 1 defeat, and the defeat was in a dead rubber. Following the back-to-back thrashings, there was much panic and disruption throughout English cricket. At an official and administrative level, there were moral questions over the nature and spirit of the game, with player safety in mind. ICC suggestions ranged from a longer pitch, a no-ball halfway line down the pitch, and a ball made of rubber. You can't imagine those sort of suggestions now. The only people not complaining about the West Indies tactics were the English players, who were really more preoccupied with the state of the pitches rather than the bowling. The bowling had simply left them shell-shocked. England's top scorer in the series by some distance was Gower, who recovered from his desperate start to play better in the second half of the tour and included 3 50s. It could be argued that his 370 runs were worth more than his 700 against Australia the previous summer. As Gooch said of his teammate, because he was such a languidly classical batsman, it's often ignored that David was full of guts and immense courage when the fast bowling was at its most dangerous. It was an understated courage, and he would laugh it off later in the evening with a typical quip. But I knew from the other end how many times I was to witness his fearlessness and genuine bottle. The captaincy of the England team would go to Mike Gatting, who following his return from injury would lead them to a successful Ashes win 18 months later. But the reality was that English cricket was in a mess from an organisational perspective, and the next series against the West Indies at home would see 4 different captains lead the side. As England creaked their way to the end of the decade and the West Indies began their slow and gradual demise, it paved the way for a new-look, dominant Australia side to emerge. But by this stage, the world game had changed, and there were challengers from the subcontinent who brought new skills into the game, not solely reliant on fast bowling alone to win matches. This subject will form the basis of the next episode of Gods and Flannelled Fools. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye for now.